We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Shaun Jeffery.
The slave labor camp. That was in November 1940. No human language can describe life in this camp, or I wouldn't call it existence, it's not life. So I was standing from early morning till late in the night in the ice water. It lasted 4 months. If it lasted longer, I don't think I would survive. People were dying there, just out of sheer overwork. Considering, that they didn't perform their quota, I mean the camp, our camp, it was one of archipelago. If you read Solzhenitsyn Archipelago, this was one of the islands of the thousands of like this. But that camp, which was surrounded along by barbed fences, people were dying, but they were sending new people. They didn't care. They know that we were only for duration of few months, our work, but they need.
Deep within the barren expanse of Russia's frozen interior, approximately 2 days' drive east of Moscow, in the heart of the Siberian wilderness, lies the city of Tomsk. Originally founded over 400 years ago by Tsar Boris Godunov in 1604, when the Tsar sent 200 Cossacks under the command of Vasily Tirkov and Gavril Ivanovich Pishemsky to construct a fortress on the bank of the Tom River, overlooking what would eventually become the modern city of Tomsk. Now northwest of the city of Tomsk lies the Ob River, and in the Ob River is a little island. This island was to be the setting for one of Joseph Stalin's most horrific social experiments. This tiny island officially has no name. A low-lying, swampy island some 3 kilometers long and about 600 meters wide. To the Russian officers in Stalin's politburo, it was named for the local farming village of Nazino. Others would refer to it as Nazinski Island. But to the locals, the island had a much more sinister name. A name that speaks for itself when reflecting the horrors that unfolded on that little slice of Russian hellscape. To the locals, the island is known simply as Cannibal Island, or the Island of Death.
In terms of ruthlessness, bloodlust, Stalin remains one of the greatest villains of the 20th century. Just before World War II, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. That fell apart in June of 1941 when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union.
When the Germans turned and began to invade Russia, they underestimated Joe Stalin. The siege of Stalingrad was so great there was no food on either side. So the German soldiers would give little children who were residents of Stalingrad a crust of bread if they would fill their canteens from the Volvo River. And as the children came back into Stalingrad, they were shot by Stalin snipers. That's how he consolidated his power. The most feared man in Russia, and with very good reason.
Now, to understand how such a tragedy as the Nazinski Island social experiment could take place, we must first understand the Gulag. The Gulag was a system of forced labour camps established during Joseph Stalin's long reign as dictator of the Soviet Union. The word Gulag in itself is an acronym for Glavno Upravlenie Lagery, or Main Camp Administration. These notorious prisons, which incarcerated about 18 million people throughout their history, operated from the 1920s until shortly after Stalin's death in 1953. At its height, the Gulag network included hundreds of labour camps that held anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 people each. Conditions at the Gulag were brutal. Prisoners could be required to work up to 14 hours a day, often in extreme weather. Many died of starvation, disease, or exhaustion. Others were simply executed. The atrocities of the Gulag system have had a long-lasting impact that still permeates Russian society today. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Russian Communist Party, took control of the Soviet Union. When Lenin died of a stroke in 1924, Joseph Stalin propelled his way to power and became dictator. The Gulag was first established in 1919, and by 1921 the Gulag system had 84 camps. But it wasn't until Stalin's rule that the prison population reached significant numbers. From 1929 until Stalin's death, the Gulag went through a period of rapid expansion. Stalin viewed the camps as an efficient way to boost industrialization in the Soviet Union and access valuable natural resources such as timber, coal, and other minerals. Additionally, the Gulag became a destination for victims of Stalin's Great Purge, a campaign to eliminate problematic members of the Communist Party and anyone who challenged the leader. The first group of prisoners at the Gulag mostly included common criminals and prosperous peasants, known as kulaks. Many kulaks were arrested when they revolted against collectivization, a policy enforced by the Soviet government that demanded peasant farmers give up their individual farms and join collective farming. When Stalin launched his purges, a wide variety of labourers, known as, quote, political prisoners, were transported to the Gulag. Opposing members of the Communist Party, military officers and government officials were among the first targeted. Later, educated people and ordinary citizens, doctors, writers, intellects, students, artists and scientists were all sent to the Gulag. Anyone who had ties to disloyal anti-Stalinists could be imprisoned. Even women and children endured the harsh conditions of the camps. Many women faced the threat of rape or assault by male prisoners or guards. Without notice, some victims were randomly picked up by Stalin's NKVD security police and hauled to the prisons with no trial or rights to an attorney. In a sense, these, quote, arrests were nothing more than state-sanctioned abductions. Police could arbitrarily grab and imprison citizens, and the detainees received no attorney, no trial, and no illusion of justice. Straight up, V for Vendetta, fingermen kind of shit. One example via the BBC. Gulag survivor Vasily Kovalyov committed the egregious offence of chopping crops down with a sabre instead of a sickle, which authorities deemed anti-Soviet sabotage. Kovalyov and other inmates had to cut down freezing trees using handsaws and dig in the icy ground with pickaxes. Some inmates had to mine for coal or copper by digging with their bare hands. So Kovalyov and some of his fellow inmates staged a jailbreak, hiding for 5 months underground. Within 3 months, they became so desperately hungry that they ate wood shavings. When they thought they had tasted freedom, they got arrested, whereupon Kovalyov tasted the jugular of a sheepdog that the police sicked on him. The hungry fugitive kicked the dog with his steel-toed boots, bit its throat, and felt the dog die in his mouth. And Vasily Kovalyov was one of the lucky ones. He regained his freedom after Stalin's death. Not everyone had such an easy ride as just biting a dog to death.
Siberian woods are very dense. There's virtually one on top of the other. And a gulag is a clearing of the woods and some buildings made out of the wooden logs. There was no closing between the logs, so the wind was free to come. And the beds consisted of a wooden thing with straw on it. And the straw had seen previous prisoners, and it was awful.
The Cannibal Island tragedy was the product of pitiless Soviet efficiency. Secret police head Genrik Yagoda and Matvey Berman, head of the Gulag system, dreamed up a brutal social engineering project aimed at, quote, resettling at least 2 million people in the remote reaches of Siberia and Soviet Kazakhstan. The idea was that these, quote, settlers would bring millions of hectares of land into cultivation and develop self-sufficient communities within 2 years. In part, the plan was aimed at covering up the ongoing famine in Ukraine and other parts of the country. To generate these settlers, the government reinstated the hated system of domestic passports that had been banned after the 1917 Bolshevik coup. Almost immediately, police throughout the country began rounding up anyone found in a place other than where they were registered. 2 documented examples. Broza Rakamitsova, 12 years old and not able to speak Russian. She was passing through Moscow with her mother. She was left alone for only a moment whilst her mother went to buy bread. In that time, she was taken by the police and deported, alone. Galina Gorbulova, wife of a Russian naval commander aboard the warship Aurora. She was arrested while passing through Moscow station on her way home to Leningrad. Although she was pregnant and had all of her documentation with her, she was arrested and transported to Nazinski Island. Now, according to the plan of Yagoda and Berman, the deportees would pass through transit camps at either Tomsk, Achinsk, or Omsk. The largest camp was at Tomsk, which had to be rebuilt from scratch, starting in April to hold 15,000 deportees. And almost immediately, the logistics began to break down. "25,000 deportees arrived in April, even though the camp was not scheduled to be completed until the 1st of May. River transport to the final labour camps was closed until the start of May, until ice on the Ob and Tom rivers had cleared. Most of the first arrivals were kulaks and other agricultural workers. The arrival of so many deportees panicked the Tomsk authorities, who viewed them as, quote, starving and contagious, end quote. The social experiment began with 4 river barges, which were designed to haul timber. They were filled with about 5,000 deportees on the 14th of May, 1933. The authorities who were to be in charge of the labour camps were first informed that these deportees would be sent 9 days earlier, on the 5th of May. The authorities had never worked with urban deportees and they had no resources or supplies to support them. The deportees were kept below decks on the barges and apparently fed a daily ration of 200 grams, 7 ounces of bread per person. 20 tons of flour, about 4 kilograms or 9 pounds each, were also transported, but the barges contained no other food, cooking utensils, or tools. All supervisory personnel, 2 commanders and 50 guards, were all newly recruited and had no shoes or uniforms. Fair to say that this was a recipe for disaster. The barges unloaded their passengers during the afternoon of May 18th on Nazinski Island. There was no roster of the disembarking deportees, but on arrival, 322 women and 4,556 men were counted, plus 27 bodies of those who had already died during the trip from Tomsk. Over a third of the deportees were too weak to stand on arrival. But that didn't stop the authorities, 9 days later, sending 1,200 more prisoners to the island. A fight broke out and guards fired on the deportees as the 20 tons of flour were deposited on the island and distribution began. The flour was moved to the shore opposite the island and distribution on the island was tried again the next morning, with another fight and more shots being fired into the starving deportees. After numerous attempts and numerous fights breaking out, all flour was distributed via brigadiers, who collected flour for their brigade of about 150 people. The brigadiers, though, were often criminals themselves who abused their positions. There were no ovens to bake bread, so the deportees ate the flour mixed with river water, which of course quickly led to dysentery. Some deportees attempted to make primitive rafts to try and escape, but most of the rafts collapsed and hundreds of corpses washed up on the shore below the island. Guards hunted and killed other escapees, as if they were hunting animals for sport. Because of the lack of any transportation to the rest of the country except upstream to Tomsk, and the harshness of life in the taiga forest, any other escapees who made it across the river and evaded the guards were ultimately presumed dead. Society on the island quickly began to break down. It devolved into absolute chaos. The majority of the population were city dwellers, most of whom knew nothing about basic agricultural practices such as clearing and cultivation that would make the island properly habitable. Not that you would be able to grow much there anyway. The sparsity of resources led to gangs forming, who began using violence to dominate the island. People were frequently murdered in fights over food and money, and the bodies of those in possession of anything of value, such as gold tooth fillings and crowns, were often looted. The guards established their own reign of terror, extorting settlers and executing people for minor offences, despite being fairly apathetic towards the gangs. Even the doctors sent to monitor the island's population, who were supposed to have protection, began to fear for their lives. The lack of proper food and the frequency of death by late May led to the first circumstances of cannibalism, and before long, cannibalism was widespread, to the point that settlers eventually began murdering individuals for the sole purpose of consuming them. 3 days after the last barge load of prisoners arrived, on May 21st, 3 health officers counted 70 new deaths, with signs of cannibalism observed in at least 5 cases. Over the next month, guards arrested more than 50 people for cannibalism. Soviet documents preserved in the Gulag Museum in Tomsk record the interrogations of some of the criminals who were on Nazinski Island. One was asked if he had eaten, quote, human meat. This was his response, quote,
No, that is not true. I only ate livers and hearts. It was very simple, just like shashlik. We made skewers from willow branches, cut it into pieces, stuck it on the skewers, and roasted it over the campfire. I picked those who were not quite living but not quite dead. It was obvious that they were about to go, that in a day or two they'd give up. So it was easier for them that way. Now, quickly, without suffering for another 2 or 3 days.
End quote. And then, there is the story of a 13-year-old girl sent to the island for bark and lumber for her indigenous people. She saw a woman being carried by guards after having to trade food for sex by one of them called Kostya. She then speaks, quote, People caught the girl, tied her to a poplar tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat. Everything. Everything. They had to eat. When Kostya came back, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood. End quote. There is also rumours of families murdering and eating the weakest child or family member, of the young having to eat the bodies of their parents just to survive. The cruel irony to it all, though, is that shortly after the deportees had arrived on Nazinski Island, or Nazino Island, Cannibal Island, the Island of Death, the Yagoda and Berman plan was actually rejected by Stalin. The dire situation on Nazinski Island was finally ended by the Soviet authorities in early June. In a period of just 13 weeks, of the roughly 6,000 deportee settlers intended for Nazinski Island, between 1,500 to 2,000 had died due to starvation, exposure, disease, murder, or accidental death. Another 2,000 settlers had disappeared and their whereabouts were untraceable, so they were presumed dead, or more likely eaten. When the settlement was dissolved in early June, the surviving 2,856 deportees were transferred to smaller settlements upstream on the Nazino River, leaving 157 deportees who could not be moved from the island for health reasons. Despite the settlement being disestablished, several hundred more of the deportees died during the transfer. People who survived the transfer found themselves with few tools, little food, and on top of that there was an outbreak of typhus. In early July, new settlements were constructed by the authorities using non-deportee labour, but only 250 Nazinski Island settlers were transferred to these. Instead, 4,200 new deportees who arrived from Tomsk were housed in these new settlements. The events of Nazinski Island wouldn't really come to light until one particular report came to Stalin. A report on the events which was sent to Stalin by Vasily Velichko was distributed to members of the politburo and was preserved in Russian archives. It stated that 6,114, quote, outdated elements, also known as declassee and socially harmful elements, or classless people, arrived on the island in May of 1933, and at least 27 people died during the river transport. There was no shelter on the island. It snowed the first night, and no food was distributed for 4 days. On the first day, 295 people were buried. Velichko's letter to Stalin on August 20th claimed only 2,200 people survived out of about 6,700 deportees that he calculated had arrived from Tomsk. Velichko's letter resulted in a commission by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to try and uncover what had actually happened. In October, the commission estimated that of the roughly 2,000 survivors from Nazinski Island, half were ill and bedridden, and that only about 200 to 300 were physically capable of working again. The events that occurred at Nazinski Island highlighted issues with Soviet colonization projects, and the Soviet leadership began to doubt their quality and efficiency. After the initial investigations in late 1933, the events at Nazinski Island were largely forgotten, as they were not made public, and only a small number of survivors, government officials, and eyewitnesses knew anything of their occurrence. In 1988, details of the Nazinski affair first became available to the general public through the efforts of the human rights group Memorial. Quote,
They were trying to escape. They asked us, "Where's the railway?" We'd never seen a railway. They asked us, "Where's Moscow? Leningrad?" They were asking the wrong people. We'd never heard of those places. We're Ostiaks. People were running away starving. They were given a handful of flour. They mixed it with water and drank it, and they immediately got diarrhea. The things we saw. People were dying everywhere. They were just killing each other.
End quote. The Gulag system started to weaken immediately after Stalin's death in 1953. Within days, millions of prisoners were released. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was a staunch critic of the camps, the purges, and most of Stalin's policies. But the camps didn't disappear completely. Some were restructured to serve as prisons for criminals, democratic activists, and anti-Soviet nationalists during the 1970s and 80s. It wasn't until about 1987 that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, the grandson of Gulag victims himself, officially began the process of completely eliminating the camps. The true horrors of the Gulag system were revealed belatedly. Before the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, state archives were sealed. Unlike the Holocaust camps in Europe during World War II, no film or images of the Gulag camps were made available to the public. In 1973, the Gulag Archipelago was published in the West by Russian historian and Gulag survivor Alexander Solzhenitsyn, though only a few underground copies were available in the Soviet Union at the time. The influential book detailed the atrocities of the Gulag system and its impact on the lives of prisoners and their families. Solzhenitsyn was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970. He was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974, but returned to Russia in 1994. Although the Gulag provided a system of cheap labour, most historians agree that the camps ultimately didn't make a significant contribution to the Soviet economy. Experts believe that without enough food and supplies, workers were unequipped to provide productive results. The dark history of the Gulag has left generations of Russians scarred and damaged. Even today, some survivors are still too fearful to discuss their experiences. And really, who can blame them? You know, I'm just putting it out there. In Mother Russia, you keep your state secrets to yourself.